Shocking truth, what my dad did while Mom was away. Under the blazing summer sun. When the house was unusually quiet. The atmosphere felt heavy with untold secrets. What seemed like an ordinary weekend turned into something unforgettable, a web of tension. Forbidden emotions. And life-altering moments. You won't believe what unfolded behind closed doors. Before we unravel this gripping story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support fuels our passion to bring you even more jaw-dropping tales. Now, let's dive into the secret that changed everything. It was one of those relentlessly hot summer days when the sun scorched the earth and everything seemed to move more slowly under the oppressive heat. The air was thick. Almost tangible. As if the heat itself had weight. Outside, the world looked idyllic. With a bright, cloudless sky and the kind of vivid blue that seemed to stretch on forever. But inside our house, something felt off, a peculiar tension hung in the air. Almost imperceptible. Yet undeniable. The day was quiet. Almost too quiet. Amelia had left to visit her sister for the weekend. Leaving just the three of us, me, William, and David. The usual hum of life in our home, filled with Amelia's chatter or the clatter of dishes, was replaced by a stillness that felt foreign. It was the kind of silence that amplifies every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of a breeze through the window. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Spending time with William without the buffer of others was rare. And while part of me was curious, there was also an underlying apprehension. What would this unbroken stretch of time bring? What lay beneath the surface of this quiet day? As the hours wore on, something about William's demeanor began to shift. His usual reserved nature gave way to a more relaxed, almost playful side. He laughed freely. His jokes more animated than usual. At one point, his smile turned mischievous. His tone light but layered. As he casually proposed, "How about a trip to the movies?" His suggestion hung in the air like an invitation to something more, a break from the ordinary. Perhaps. His grin widened as he added, "Something romantic. Maybe." The words were delivered with a hint of teasing, but they carried an undertone I couldn't quite decipher. My laugh came out awkward and forced. An involuntary reaction to a tension I didn't fully understand. Yet, despite my hesitation, I found myself agreeing. We chose a movie steeped in romance, rich with moments of charged emotion. The theater was dim, the screen casting flickering shadows across our faces. As the story unfolded on the screen, I became acutely aware of William's presence beside me. His gaze lingered, not just on the film but on me during the moments of heightened emotion. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But as the film progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not in an intrusive way, but in a manner that made the air between us crackle with something unspoken. I tried to lose myself in the movie, but my focus kept drifting. My heart raced every time our eyes met. A silent exchange that felt both thrilling and disquieting. It was as if the film's tension had bled into the space between us, creating a moment suspended in time, where nothing else mattered. And then, suddenly, a sharp knock shattered the bubble. The sound echoed through the quiet, startling me. My heart jumped as I turned toward William, who signaled with a quick motion to remain still. His breathing, usually steady, had quickened. The knock came again, insistent yet measured. My steps were tentative as I approached the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? And why now? When I opened the door, relief washed over me at the sight of Mrs. Thompson, our ever-friendly neighbor. She stood there with a kind smile, holding a basket of cookies. "Hello, dear. I thought I'd bring over some treats," she said, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the house moments before. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. For a brief moment, the atmosphere lightened. Her presence felt like a gust of fresh air, dispelling the heaviness that had settled over the day. But as soon as she left, the house seemed to exhale, the previous tension rushing back in like an inevitable tide. William's posture stiffened, his earlier warmth and ease gave way to something more guarded, almost restless. The silence that followed her departure was thick, stretching out between us like an unspoken question. When I finally glanced at him, his expression had changed. His eyes, so often unreadable, now revealed a flicker of something deeper, an emotion that was at once vulnerable and searching. Longing, doubt, and perhaps even fear swirled within his gaze, leaving me unsure of what would happen next. In that moment, the weight of the day seemed to settle fully. It wasn't just the heat outside, it was the simmering undercurrent of something unspoken, a truth waiting to surface. The question was, were we ready to face it, perfectly at ease with one another? That it made me question everything. Was I imagining the tension? Had I misinterpreted his words, his looks, the way he lingered just a second too long? The doubt gnawed at me, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something had shifted, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, it was impossible to go back to how things were. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a storm of emotions, confusion, guilt, and a strange, unshakable pull toward John. The memory of his whisper, the intensity in his eyes, replayed over and over in my mind. Was it wrong to feel this way? Yes, of course, it was. But feelings don't always obey the rules. They defy logic, unraveling carefully constructed boundaries, leaving chaos in their wake. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the unspoken hung heavier with each passing moment. John seemed to oscillate between avoidance and quiet intensity, his glances growing more fleeting yet more loaded. Amelia, oblivious to it all, remained her usual cheerful self, her laughter ringing through the house as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the living room. Amelia was out running errands, and John was supposed to be working upstairs. Yet, I wasn't surprised when I heard the soft creak of footsteps behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes locking onto mine. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low and strained, as though he were wrestling with himself. "Whatever this is, it has to stop." I nodded, unable to find words. He was right. Of course. We were treading dangerous ground, risking everything for something that could never be. But as he turned to leave, I found myself calling out, "John, wait." He paused, his back to me, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. I wanted to say so much, to ask him what he truly felt, to make sense of the chaos swirling between us. But all I could manage was a whispered, "Why did you say those things that day?" He turned back slowly. His expression conflicted. Because I couldn't keep it inside anymore, he admitted. His voice barely audible. I know it's wrong. But I can't help it. You're always in my head. And it's driving me crazy. His words hit me like a thunderclap. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. And I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had expected denial. Excuses. Anything but this raw, unfiltered confession. It terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. We can't. I whispered, my voice trembling. We can't do this to Amelia. I know, he replied, his tone heavy with regret. But that doesn't change how I feel. The days that followed were a blur of tension and self-recrimination. We avoided being alone together. Though the effort felt futile. The more we tried to suppress it, the more the unspoken seemed to grow. Like a shadow creeping into every corner of our lives. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. This couldn't go on. Either we confronted it and put an end to it, or it would consume us both. It wasn't just about me and John anymore, it was about Amelia. About the life she thought she had. The trust she placed in us. The next morning, I made a decision. I would talk to John one last time. Make it clear that whatever this was, it had to end for good. No lingering looks. No whispered confessions. No more secrets. It was the only way to protect Amelia and salvage what was left of our lives. But as I walked downstairs, I found Amelia and John in the kitchen, laughing together. Their heads bent close as they shared a private joke. The sight of them stopped me in my tracks. And a wave of guilt and heartbreak crashed over me. How had I allowed things to spiral so far out of control? How had I let myself become part of something that could shatter the very foundation of their lives? That was when I realized what I had to do. Not just for Amelia, but for myself. I couldn't stay here, caught in this web of forbidden emotions. It was time to leave. To put distance between myself and the temptation that threatened to destroy everything. As I packed my bags later that day, tears blurred my vision. I didn't know where I was going or what the future held. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay here. Leaving was the hardest decision I'd ever made. But deep down, I knew it was the right one. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the house grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared from view. A part of me felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. But another part felt a flicker of hope, a chance to start anew. Free from the secrets that had bound me. And so, with a heavy heart but a resolve to move forward, I set out into the unknown, determined to find a way to heal and rebuild. Leaving the past and its forbidden temptations behind. The atmosphere was relaxed. Or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, a heavy, unspoken secret pressed down on me like an invisible weight. Amelia, blissfully unaware of the turmoil within me, turned with her usual bright-eyed energy and asked, "Hey, would you like to play a game with us?" Her smile was radiant, as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. But my heart betrayed me, its racing rhythm refusing to slow. "Sure," I replied, forcing a casual tone that I hoped would mask the storm brewing inside. As I descended the stairs, I braced myself for what awaited. The moment John's eyes met mine, the air seemed to shift, charged with an energy I couldn't fully comprehend. There it was again, that inexplicable connection. an unspoken tether that neither time nor distance had severed. My heart hammered against my chest. And for a fleeting instant, I dared to wonder if he felt it too. The evening unfolded in laughter. The kind of laughter that echoes and fills every corner of a room, weaving a tapestry of joy that seemed to envelop everyone present. Yet, amidst the lightheartedness, a deeper awareness stirred within me. I noticed John, his subtle movements drawing him closer. Each shift of his body bringing him nearer until his arm brushed against mine. It was a simple, almost accidental touch. Yet it sent a ripple through me, a jolt of excitement that felt like the embers of an old fire reigniting. With every fleeting touch, questions swirled in my mind. Was he intentionally bridging the gap between us? Or was I reading too much into it? The uncertainty gnawed at me, a tantalizing mix of hope and hesitation. My heart, unable to decide whether to leap forward or hold back, raced on with reckless abandon. Later that night, long after Amelia had retreated to her room, I found myself drawn to the quiet stillness of the living room. A soft, amber glow from a single lamp bathed the room in warmth, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. There, on the couch, sat John, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand, his gaze distant and unfocused. He looked lost, as if searching for something just out of reach. And the sight stirred something deep within me. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure if I should intrude on his solitude. But the pull was irresistible. Taking a steadying breath, I stepped inside, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hey." He looked up, startled, his expression softening as recognition dawned. "I didn't think anyone else was still awake," he said, his voice low, tinged with a weariness that felt heavier than mere exhaustion. There was a depth to his tone, a quiet vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted as I moved closer, my steps slow and deliberate. I sank into the couch beside him, leaving just enough space to breathe yet feeling the magnetic pull between us. He sighed, raking a hand through his hair in that familiar, self-reflective gesture of his. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. "I guess not," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the floor. There was a heaviness to his words, a trace of something unspoken, regret, perhaps, or maybe something else entirely. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I shouldn't have said anything earlier." The way his fingers tightened around the glass betrayed the inner turmoil he tried to mask. His words were laden with a guilt that I couldn't quite understand but felt deeply all the same. Before I could respond, Amelia's cheerful voice broke the stillness, cutting through the tension like a sudden gust of wind. She walked into the room with her signature warmth, her presence so radiant that it almost made the weight of the moment vanish. "What are you two doing up so late?" she asked, her curiosity genuine, her smile untouched by suspicion. John's response was immediate. "Practiced. Nothing important," he said, his tone casual. But his body betrayed him, the stiffness in his shoulders, the fleeting glance away. Something about his answer felt off, like a door hastily closed to keep prying eyes from seeing what lay beyond. The evening resumed its ordinary rhythm, but my mind refused to settle. Thoughts raced in endless circles, replaying every glance, every touch, every unspoken moment. What was left unsaid? And why did it feel so impossible to leave it buried? When the house finally fell silent, I returned to the living room, drawn by an unseen force. The quiet now felt different, charged with an energy that buzzed in the air. Alone with my thoughts, I let myself relive the day's events. Each moment with John replayed like a scene from a film I couldn't turn off. His closeness, his hesitation, his vulnerability, they all left me with a question I couldn't ignore. Was this the beginning of something new? Or simply the echo of something long past? As the minutes stretched into hours, I sat there in the dim light, my heart heavy with anticipation and unanswered questions. Whatever lay ahead, I knew it wouldn't leave me untouched. The house felt eerily quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Yet, inside my mind, a cacophony of thoughts raged on, loud and insistent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward bedtime when an unexpected knock shattered the stillness. It was soft but deliberate, the kind of sound that instantly pulls you out of your thoughts and sets your pulse racing. My stomach churned with unease. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the unfamiliarity of the sound filled me with a sense of foreboding. When I cautiously opened the door, my father stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. His face betrayed a mix of unease and determination, a combination that made my heartbeat quicken. He rarely wore expressions like this, and the gravity in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though tinged with hesitation. The way he spoke made it clear that whatever he had to say wasn't easy. I nodded silently, stepping aside to let him in. He entered without a word, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. We sat on the edge of my bed, the silence stretching out between us, thick and oppressive. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an unspoken tension that made my chest tighten. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be a simple conversation. My father ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of steadying himself before tackling something difficult. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know things have felt strange lately. There's been this distance between us, between everyone. Really, and I don't want to make it worse. But I also can't keep ignoring it." He paused, his eyes searching mine for a reaction. His words felt like a prelude to something monumental, and I braced myself for what was to come. Before he could say more, a faint noise outside caught both of our attention. My father rose instinctively, moving toward the window. I followed, my heart pounding in anticipation, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek through. I froze as a familiar figure stepped out of a car parked in our driveway. Aunt Carol. She wasn't supposed to arrive until the weekend. Her early appearance was strange enough, but there was something about the way she carried herself, brisk, purposeful, almost hurried, that made my nerves buzz with apprehension. "Why is she here now?" I muttered, my voice barely audible. Beside me, my father's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he replied, his tone clipped. He seemed as unsettled as I was, though neither of us voiced the thoughts racing through our minds. As the front door creaked open, Aunt Carol's cheerful voice broke the tension. "Surprise," she called out, her tone bright and chipper, completely at odds with the dread pooling in my stomach. The sound of her bags rustling and the clatter of her shoes echoed through the house as she made her way inside. I turned to my father, whispering urgently, "What do we do now?" "Nothing," he said firmly, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. We act normal. Normal. That was easier said than done when the air felt thick with unspoken tension. And my thoughts were spiraling into chaos. We stayed hidden by the window for a few more moments, listening as Aunt Carol moved through the house, her voice carrying snippets of small talk. "I just couldn't wait to see everyone," she said, her words filled with enthusiasm. But for me, her presence felt like an intrusion, a disruption to the fragile balance we were already struggling to maintain. When she finally moved into the kitchen, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My father's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "This is going to get messy," I murmured, half to myself. My father didn't reply immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the doorway, as if expecting Aunt Carol to reappear at any moment. "Just stay calm," he said finally, his voice low. "We'll figure this out." But even as he spoke, I could see the worry etched into his features. It was the kind of worry that came from knowing things were about to change, irrevocably and without warning. For now, we were left with questions and uncertainties, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your thoughts and made it impossible to think clearly. And as Aunt Carol's laughter echoed from the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than either of us could have anticipated. "Yes. But we can manage," William replied, his voice steady, though the flicker of worry in his eyes betrayed the storm of thoughts swirling beneath the surface. His gaze remained locked with mine, unwavering and intense, as if silently urging me to understand that we were in this together, no matter how awkward, difficult, or uncertain the road ahead might be. In that moment, it felt as though he was reaching out, not with his hands but with the sheer force of his resolve, offering a lifeline I wasn't sure I was ready to grab. I nodded slowly, a strange mix of reassurance and vulnerability washing over me, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. "I trust you," I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling under the gravity of the moment. The admission hung in the air between us, fragile yet profound, carrying a truth I had kept buried deep within. Just as the atmosphere seemed to thicken with unspoken words, Aunt Carol's cheerful voice broke through, startling me out of my reverie. She reappeared in the doorway, her grin wide and unbothered, as though completely oblivious to the undercurrent of tension swirling in the room. "Are you all ready for movie night?" she chirped, her tone bright and infectious, radiating a kind of enthusiasm that felt almost jarring against the turmoil inside me. I forced a smile, though it felt more like a mask than an expression. "Sure. Let's do it," I replied, my voice straining to sound normal. Beneath the surface, frustration bubbled, clawing at my composure. As we moved to the living room and settled into our spots, I felt a growing disconnect between the mundane normalcy of the setting and the storm brewing within me. The movie started, but I couldn't focus. The flickering images on the screen were a blur, drowned out by the chaos of my thoughts. My mind kept circling back to William, replaying his words and his steady gaze over and over. Every so often, I stole glances at him, my eyes drawn to him as though pulled by a magnetic force. The tension between us felt almost tangible, an invisible thread stretched taut, ready to snap at any moment. It wasn't just tension, it was something deeper, more profound, a shared understanding of the unspoken, a silent acknowledgement of everything we weren't saying. When the credits rolled, Aunt Carol stretched and yawned dramatically. "Well, that's enough excitement for one night," "I'm heading to bed," she announced, standing up from the couch with an air of contentment. "You too should get some rest." "Too. Good night." "Good night," we murmured in unison, though my voice felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. My pulse quickened as she disappeared down the hallway, leaving us alone in the dimly lit room. The quiet enveloped us. But it wasn't a comforting stillness, it was charged, alive with the anticipation of what might come next. I turned toward William, my heart pounding. His presence was steady, but his expression mirrored the uncertainty I felt. I hesitated before breaking the silence, my voice trembling as I asked, "What happens now?" The question wasn't just about the immediate moment, it was about everything. The uncharted path that stretched out before us. The choices we hadn't yet made. The truths we hadn't yet faced. He looked at me, his eyes shadowed with doubt and something deeper, something that almost looked like longing. I felt the air grow heavier, the space between us shrinking in ways that had nothing to do with physical proximity. "Maybe we can take a chance," I said softly, my voice a fragile thread that threatened to break under the weight of my emotions. The words weren't bold, but they carried a quiet urgency, a plea for something neither of us dared name. For a moment, he didn't respond, his gaze flickering with hesitation. I could see the battle playing out in his eyes. The push and pull of fear and desire, reason and instinct. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to carry the weight of a decision he wasn't entirely sure of. "Okay," he said, his voice soft but resonating with a vulnerability that sent a shiver down my spine. "Just one kiss." The words hung in the air, each syllable echoing with a meaning far greater than the simplicity of the request. It wasn't just a kiss he was asking for, it was a moment of connection. A step into uncharted territory. A leap of faith. I leaned in, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. My breath hitched, every nerve in my body alight with anticipation. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of us, suspended in a fragile moment where anything felt possible. But just as the distance between us dwindled to nothing, Aunt Carol's voice pierced the silence like a lightning bolt. "Hey! Are you both okay out here?" she called, her tone casual and upbeat, completely unaware of the delicate thread she had just severed. Her voice shattered the moment, sending us both reeling back into reality. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the spell was broken. The tension evaporated, replaced by an awkward, stifling silence. William turned away, his expression unreadable, and I found myself wondering if the fragile connection we had begun to forge was lost forever. We froze instantly, our bodies locking in place as though the air around us had turned to stone. A surge of raw panic crashed over me, its intensity overwhelming. My chest tightened as my heart raced like a drumbeat in a storm, each pulse echoing in my ears. Time seemed to unravel, stretching agonizingly long as I instinctively stepped back, my legs trembling beneath me. A quick glance at my father revealed his expression, mirroring my own, a turbulent mixture of fear, apprehension, and determination. We were both trapped between two conflicting forces, the burning need to confront the truth and the primal instinct to preserve the fragile balance we had desperately clung to. "Yes. We're okay," I managed to call out, my voice quivering despite every effort to project calm. The words barely sounded convincing, even to me. My throat tightened as anxiety churned in the pit of my stomach, leaving my hands damp with sweat. I strained to hear, holding my breath as I waited for her footsteps to fade into the distance. With every passing second, my silent plea grew louder, "Go back. Leave us to figure this out ourselves." If you're still watching this video and find the story moving, let me know you're with me by dropping a 3 in the comments. Your support means everything. The seconds dragged like hours. The room cloaked in a suffocating silence broken only by the faint creak of Aunt Carol's retreating steps. Her presence lingered like a shadow even as the sound of her movements finally disappeared into the hallway. A heavy stillness settled over us once more. My chest heaved as I turned to my father. Urgency and unease warring within me. The air between us seemed charged, like the moment before a storm unleashes its fury. "We can't keep hiding this," my father said, his voice low but resolute, cutting through the tension with quiet strength. His gaze met mine, steady and unyielding, a spark of determination lighting his usually weary eyes. "It's time to tell her. We can't keep pretending everything is fine." I swallowed hard, his words ringing with a truth I couldn't deny. A mixture of fear and relief welled up in me, tightening my chest as I nodded. "Tell her," I echoed, the simplicity of the words at odds with the immense weight they carried. This was the precipice we had been skirting for so long, the irreversible moment where choices would be made, and nothing would ever be the same. For a few fleeting seconds, we stood frozen in the quiet, exchanging a glance laden with unspoken understanding. We both knew the gravity of what lay ahead. My father's gaze urged me forward, and I drew in a shaky breath, summoning a courage I wasn't sure I had. "Aunt Carol, we need to talk," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. It only took a moment for her to reappear in the doorway, her cheerful demeanor a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in the room. Her smile faltered as her eyes flickered between our solemn faces, and the lightheartedness in her expression gave way to a cautious concern. "What is it?" she asked, her tone tinged with uncertainty, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thread. "It's about how we feel," I replied, the words trembling on my lips but spilling out nonetheless. Each syllable felt like a stone dropping into a deep well, echoing into an abyss of unknown reactions. My breath hitched as the magnitude of the moment settled over me. Her eyes widened, confusion and disbelief rippling across her face. For a moment, she simply stared, as if trying to piece together the gravity of what I had just said. "Wait, you mean," she began, her voice trailing off, the sentence left incomplete. "Yes," my father interjected, his voice calm yet brimming with quiet resolve. His unwavering gaze rested on Aunt Carol, and the sincerity in his words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "We need to address this. We care about you deeply. But we also need to be honest, with you and with ourselves." The room seemed to contract, the air thick with the intensity of emotions that none of us could yet fully articulate. Aunt Carol's expression shifted as the truth settled in, her eyes darting downward while her fingers fidgeted nervously with the hem of her sweater. The cheerful exterior she always wore cracked ever so slightly, revealing a vulnerability beneath it. The silence stretched on, heavy with the words left unsaid. As we all grappled with the implications of this moment, a turning point none of us could turn away from. The silence between us grew, stretching like a taut rope ready to snap. It wasn't just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating quiet, filled with the unspoken weight of everything we were too afraid to say. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, each thud a reminder of how tense the room had become. My breaths came shallow and uneven, the air around me thick with anticipation. All of us were waiting, hanging on to the unbearable pause. Until Aunt Carol finally looked up. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, seemed to search for something, answers, reassurance, or perhaps even denial. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, trembling under the weight of her emotions. "I never saw this coming," she murmured, her words faltering like fragile glass on the verge of shattering. Each syllable carried the unmistakable echo of shock, as though the revelation had struck her in a way she couldn't yet fully comprehend. "I know," I said, my voice cracking under the strain of what I had to admit. The words felt heavy, bitter as they rolled off my tongue, and I could barely bring myself to meet her gaze. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something we wanted. But it was desperate, and it's tearing us apart. The confession felt like an anchor sinking into my chest, dragging me into a vulnerability I wasn't sure I could bear. It was out now, raw and exposed, and there was no taking it back. I could feel my hands trembling as I clenched them into fists, desperate to find some semblance of control in a moment that felt completely unmoored. Aunt Carol blinked rapidly, her expression shifting between disbelief, confusion, and a deep, aching hurt. She stepped back, almost instinctively, as if she needed physical distance to process the emotional storm brewing inside her. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only the visible struggle to grasp the full gravity of the situation. "I need time," she said softly, her voice fragile and uneven. "I need time to think." Her words lingered in the air like a fragile thread, wavering but holding on. She looked away, her eyes distant, as though retreating into an inner world where she could make sense of what had just unfolded. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the pain I could see etched across her face. I wanted to tell her how sorry I was, how torn and conflicted I felt, how none of this was meant to hurt her. But the words wouldn't come. Nothing seemed adequate. Nothing could bridge the chasm that had suddenly opened between us. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a lead blanket. The enormity of it all was suffocating, the realization that this wasn't just a misunderstanding we could brush aside or a fleeting moment we could forget. This was real. It was raw. And it was about to change everything. The silence between us thickened again, heavier than before, as though the room itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just her, all of us were suspended in that fragile, heart-wrenching pause, waiting for the inevitable shift that we knew would follow. This moment was about more than just words. It was about the unspoken truths we tried so hard to bury, the emotions we'd been too afraid to confront, and the difficult choices we could no longer avoid. It was a moment of reckoning, a crossroads where everything we had known about ourselves, about each other, was being called into question. As the dust settles and the truth comes to light, we're left to reflect on the consequences of actions hidden in the shadows. This unforgettable story serves as a powerful reminder that even the quietest moments can hold the weight of life-changing decisions. What we do in secret, how we handle our emotions, and the choices we make when we think no one is watching, these can shape our future in ways we can't undo. As we look ahead, let's take this as a lesson: honesty, trust, and self-awareness are the foundation of any relationship. Don't let the weight of unspoken secrets linger in your life. If this story made you think, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us create more thought-provoking content. Thank you for being with us today. Until next time, Take care and stay tuned for our next video.